Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Akan. My name is Akan Triputra, and I will be your moderator for Cribb for today. It's a wonderful and precious day today because in Canberra it is cold but really, warm because of this meeting and because of the independence of Indonesia today. Indonesian people feeling really warm, and we will remind something about our Independence Day because of this discussion actually regarding Jago and Revolusi Nasional Indonesia. First of all, let us praise our God because we are in a good condition, healthy, and very, very happy situation. Then we can attend this meeting and we can discuss something deeper about Indonesian Revolution regarding the Jago and everything today. And thank you for Mr. Yusuf Habibi, Mr. Sulkan Juhdi, and Mr. Reza Maulana Hikam for making this discussion happen. In this very beautiful moment, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Robert Cribb from Australia National University. And what is it? We will talk about something bigger and in a picture, and we would like to praise Mr. Robert Cribb for discuss something about it today. And it will be our idea. It will be Madat Group and also Komunitas Madani chance to empower our Indonesian citizen and our society actually to remind about how the fighting and how the revolutionary movement in Indonesia make Indonesia great again and also our Independence Day. Maybe Mr. Professor Robert Kitt would you like to start our discussion for presenting the ideas and something?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I am especially honored, especially happy that today is Indonesian Independence Day. So it's a very special day to be able to talk about my research on the years of the independence struggle. When I began as a university student in Australia, I was very much admiring of the Indonesian independence struggle. I first heard about the independence struggle when I was at high school, and I was struck by the fact that Indonesia was the first Asian country to seize independence from a Western colonial power in the 20th century, and that it did so in the face of enormous difficulties. I was also very much impressed by the strategy that was followed by the Indonesian people and by the government of the Republic of Indonesia in this struggle. There was a combination of diplomacy and armed struggle, diplomasi dan perjuangan, which was a particularly effective strategy in dealing with a complex international environment. So not only did the leaders of the Indonesian Republic negotiate with the British, with the Americans, with Australians and with others, but Indonesia also fought an armed struggle against the Dutch army, which was attempting to return to Indonesia. And I remember when I was a student being excited by this struggle, and I decided that this was what I would like to do my PhD research on. So then I went to London to do my PhD, and I chose a project that looked at the experience of Republican leaders, Republican people in Jakarta during the revolutionary period. Now, as you know, Jakarta was occupied by the Dutch, by the Allied forces, and then by the Dutch quite early in the revolution. So the city was more or less under Dutch control. However, it was recognized still as the capital city of both Hindia Belanda, the Netherlands Indies, and Indonesia, and a republican administration, Pemerintah Kota, the Balai Kota, under Suwiryo, was able to continue functioning inside Jakarta until the middle of 1947. In addition to that, there was a Republican delegation led by Sultan Syahrir, which was based in Jakarta, and this delegation was in charge of negotiations with the Dutch in order to seek a settlement that would lead eventually to the Dutch recognition of Indonesian independence. What I was interested in this research was the difficulties which Indonesian nationalists faced in a complex environment of an occupied city, a city where the soldiers in the streets were Dutch, but nonetheless there was some element of Indonesian sovereignty. I was interested in the way that Indonesian negotiators dealt with Dutch negotiators when it was becoming clear that the Dutch were not really interested in a settlement. They were interested in buying time in order to strengthen their forces for military action against the Republic. So my interest was in leaders and ordinary people who were coping with occupation in Jakarta. But then I went to the Dutch archives and I began to read Dutch intelligence reports, Dutch military reports. And it started to become clear to me that the role of the Laskar Rakyat Jakarta Raya was very important. That although the nationalists in Jakarta were doing everything they could to support the Republic, what was really limiting the expansion of Dutch power was armed force. And it was not the armed force of the Indonesian army, which went through various names from Badan Keamanan Rakyat, Tentara Keamanan Rakyat, Tentara Republik Indonesia, Tentara Nasional Indonesia, but it was organizations like the Laskar Rakyat Jakarta Raya. And it also became clear to me that the people who had joined this Laskar Rakyat were not just young nationalists, not just students, but also members of the Jakarta underworld. They were garong, they were members of the criminal, they were perampok, members of the criminal underworld. Now, this was the 1980s. It seems a very long time ago now. And many of us were very much impressed at that time by the writing of Eric Hobsbawm. He was an English historian who wrote about revolution in Britain and France. And he identified what he called social bandits. Social bandits were criminals, rural criminals, perampok in the countryside, who had a social and political conscience. In other words, they weren't simply interested in stealing money and goods from other people. They were interested in social progress. They would rob from the rich, steal from the rich, and give to the poor. Now, Hobsbawm thought that these social bandits were not, in the long term, ever likely to be effective. He said they didn't really have political consciousness that was advanced enough to lead a true revolution. But when I looked at the garong, when I looked at the Laskar Rakyat in Jakarta, it seemed to me that here was a group of former criminals who had joined the national struggle, and even if they were not very sophisticated, they were nonetheless an important part of the struggle of the Indonesian people against Dutch colonialism. And they were a manifestation of the wide support that Indonesia, the idea of Indonesia, had amongst the Indonesian people. So in the thesis and in the book that came from the thesis, I wrote about the emergence of these garong, about the emergence of the Laskar Rakyat, and the role that they had played in the revolution against the Dutch. Now, of course, they weren't 100% noble. They weren't 100% progressive. They stole from travelers. They killed many people, but nonetheless, they played a very important role in defending the Indonesian Republic at a time when it was extremely vulnerable. It seems to me that if the Laskar Rakyat in Jakarta had not existed, then it would have been much easier for the Dutch forces to suppress the Indonesian Republic that was declared in 1945. Of course, colonialism could not have lasted in Indonesia, but nonetheless, the republic that was created in 1945 might not have survived. Now, I did this research and I wrote the book during the New Order, at a time when the army, then the Angkatan Bersenjata Republik Indonesia, was politically very powerful, and when it claimed the right to political power, partly on the basis of its role in the revolution against the Dutch. I remember many conversations that I had with army officers who referred especially to the second Dutch attack in 1948-49, when Sukarno and the leaders of the Republican cabinet were captured and taken to Bangka, held as prisoners there, while General Sudirman went into the countryside and continued the guerrilla struggle. And these army officers said that is why the army has a right to be in power in Indonesia. But it seemed to me that in the early stages of the revolution, it was not the army, but it was the Laskar Rakyat that had saved the republic, and that the story of the revolution needs to be told as a story of all the Indonesian people who joined in resisting the return of colonialism. So when I was writing my book, the most important thing I thought that I had to say was to stress that the struggle against the Dutch was not just a military struggle, it was not just a diplomatic struggle, but it was also a struggle of a wider range of groups within Indonesian society. In some of my later research, something that I have not yet published, but I'll talk a little bit about it, I have realized that even in the areas outside Java and Sumatra, even in the areas that were occupied by the Dutch, the role of the people was very important in resisting Dutch rule, resisting the return to colonialism. And this importance arose because of the Dutch political strategy. So the leaders on the Dutch side were well aware, I think, that colonialism in its old form could not be restored. But they believed that the majority of Indonesian people were sympathetic to the Dutch, would be happy to see some kind of modified Dutch rule return. And as a result, in the federal states that the Dutch established in eastern Indonesia, in Kalimantan, in parts of Java and Sumatra, the Dutch held elections in 1946, 1947, and 1948. In some places, there were even 2 successive elections. And the Dutch political strategy was to be able to say, in our territory, we have established governments that are based on electoral democracy. The people voted for these governments, whether it was the government in Pasundan or the government in Negara Indonesia Timur or the government in Negara Sumatra Timur. They wanted to say, these are governments that have public support. And they used the slogan, "Who voted for the Indonesian Republic?" And of course, there had not been elections except for a relatively small set of elections in Yogyakarta in late 1945. So this was a very clever political strategy, but it failed completely, because when these elections were held in the occupied territories, it was Republican parties which won the elections. So by 1948, it was, and certainly by 1949, it was clear to the Dutch that they had no political strategy, because the mass of the Indonesian people supported the Republic and had voted for Republican parties when they were given the opportunity. So my later research also supports this argument that the revolution was supported by the mass of the Indonesian people. Now, of course, a historian, an author, never knows how his book or her book is going to be received by readers, by the public. My book, called Gangsters and Revolutionaries, in fact, was not especially received as a statement about the relative importance of the Indonesian army and the Indonesian people. Instead, it was seen as one of the first attempts to show the relationship between the Indonesian government and the criminal world. So the gangsters, the garong who joined the Laskar Rakyat, was seen as the forerunners of the criminal elements who were later recruited by people like Ali Murtopo and Beni Mordani as informal militia forces to support the New Order government, and which, of course, later turned out to be important in many parts of Indonesia. So the story of the book is a story of something which began out of an admiration for the Indonesian struggle for independence, but ended up as a work that has been used to highlight some of the less attractive sides of Indonesian politics. So I now look forward very much to talking to you further about the book. I'm happy to have questions in English or in Indonesian, and I will do my best to answer as I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Robert Cribb, for the explanation regarding the book of Jago and Revolution in Indonesia. I would like to give some conclusion about your presented idea. The first one is the most interesting things in Indonesia. Struggle are about its combination in negotiation and also in the armed forces. They can do those things in an amazing movement. The second one, Laskar Rakyat is a criminal who joined the struggle of Indonesian people against Dutch colonialism. They played a good role to achieve independence from the Dutch. The third one, your book was written in new order. It's not the army that struggled so much, but it was the Laskar Rakyat. The struggle is not only about diplomacy, not only about forces, but also in wider elements. The colonial used election to gain public support, but it failed completely because every single election that held by the colonial is won by the Republican Party from Indonesia itself. Okay, maybe, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, please kindly raise your hand. Maybe you have some question for this topic, or I will read the conclusion in Indonesia first. Jadi yang dijelaskan sama Profesor Robert Cribb tadi, bahwa Laskar Rakyat ini merupakan suatu hal eksponen yang esensial bagi Indonesia karena dia merupakan suatu kelompok kriminal yang akhirnya bergabung ke perjuangan rakyat dan bersama juga militer, juga diplomasi sebagainya. Dan bahkan ini menjadi suatu hal yang sentral karena perjuangan militer waktu itu tidak begitu keras seperti yang dilakukan sama Laskar Rakyat. Nah, mungkin dari sini adakah pertanyaan yang so it is actually really complicated if we are going through a bigger picture that Indonesian people actually see that military has won the Independence Day. I mean, like every single book, every single educational letter from Indonesian government said that Indonesian independence is gained because of the struggle of the heroes, of the military, of the negotiation of Soekarno, and something else. Mungkin teman-teman ada pertanyaan kalau dari poin ini, karena yang dijelaskan sama Profesor Robert Cribb tadi begitu kompleks dan sebenarnya sangat berbeda jauh dari buku-buku pelajaran yang sudah kita pelajari. Karena dalam buku pelajaran di Indonesia, Prof. Robert, kemerdekaan Indonesia itu didapatkan karena struggle-nya para militer. Kita mengenal peta, kita mengenal TNI, TKR, dan lain sebagainya. Terus diplomasi Soekarno, Sudirman, dan lain sebagainya. Mungkin teman-teman ada pertanyaan dari situ. Silahkan raise hand kalau memang ingin bertanya. Pertanyaan boleh menggunakan bahasa Indonesia dan juga boleh menggunakan bahasa Inggris. Ya, silahkan teman-teman. Atau sebelum itu, Prof. Robert, mungkin saya ada pertanyaan.
Tentu.
Ada pertanyaan, Prof. Robert. Mungkin saya akan menyampaikan ini dalam bahasa Indonesia karena agar semuanya juga bisa mengikuti dengan baik. Kalau dilihat dari Indonesian struggle, kita melihat bahwa perang ini adalah mengenai independence only, mengenai kemerdekaan saja. Is there any complexion of objective that Laskar Rakyat inginkan? Apa yang istilahnya Laskar Rakyat ini inginkan selain independence? Kalau dilihat kan background-nya it's actually really different of Laskar Rakyat and the military. Kalau kita melihat military itself, itu the only achievement is the independence. What about the Laskar Rakyat? I mean, like, what is the true goals of Laskar Rakyat itself? Karena kalau saya lihat tidak mungkin hanya kemerdekaan. Seperti itu, Bro.
Oke, itu menarik sekali. So if I look at the Indonesian nationalist movement as a whole, then what I see is an aspiration for two things: for justice and prosperity, for keadilan and kemakmuran. And of course, those two terms are very general. Keadilan means different things for different people. Kemakmuran means different things for different people. but nonetheless, those are ideals that tie together nearly everyone in the Indonesian nationalist movement. Now, when the revolution is over, of course, it's only a partial victory. The Netherlands has retained control of Irian Barat. There is still a Netherlands-Indonesian union. Indonesia has a debt to the Netherlands. And in addition to that, all of the problems that have built up in Indonesia since the time of the Depression, the Malaysia time of the 1930s. So nearly 20 years of very difficult economic and political times. Depression, and then Japanese occupation, and then revolution, during which there is much destruction of infrastructure, when young Indonesians cannot get education, when there is starvation. There's enormous starvation in the countryside in the last year of the Japanese occupation. So Indonesia is in a very difficult position at the end of 1949. Expectations are very high. And of course, those expectations are immediately disappointed. Indonesia cannot possibly deliver to its own people the justice and prosperity that has been promised by the independence struggle. And on top of that, and this is a serious problem, people like the Laskar Rakyat, who have contributed a great deal to the independence struggle because they were able to fight, are not especially useful in the era of construction that follows. These are people who have not much education, they're good at fighting, but they're not going to be able to help with the economic recovery of Indonesia in the 1950s. And of course, the combination of disappointment with what they see in Indonesia as a whole, and disappointment in what they experience as individuals, contributes to a great deal of tension in Indonesian society. Now, these are people who, of course, said, we are making a contribution to the Indonesian Republic that and we don't expect any gratitude, we don't expect any favors. But of course, at the end of the revolution, when they know they have made a big contribution, they're disappointed if that contribution is not recognized. So there's many, many difficulties that Indonesia faces at the beginning of 1950, when independence has finally achieved international recognition. And the problem for the Laskar Rakyat is that they don't have a role in Indonesia's future at that time. That's a big problem for them, and it's a problem for Indonesia.
So maybe the point is, Laskar Rakyat wants, their aim is about justice and prosperity. It is different from the military act. And they don't have any role in the future of Indonesia because they don't have any education. And they don't have any role in our government because they don't have the part that they should have in the beginning. Okay,
Exactly.
I get it, sir. I get it. Maybe I have further question after this, but there is a question from Gratia Wing Up. Was the Laskar Rakyat at the beginning of independence a social movement for lower middle class who was tired of politics ruled by the intellectual and the military? From here, what is the pattern of social movement that established at that time? I mean, the question was about the Laskar Rakyat itself. Is it a social movement at the beginning or what? Or maybe they have political aims or something like that. That's the question. So.
That is a very good question. So my interpretation is that they were not a class-based movement in the sense that they did not represent the middle class or the lower class or any of the upper classes. They were interested in a society that was more free and in which everyone would be more prosperous. So their enemies were not the intellectuals and the military. Their enemies were the bureaucrats and the landlords, particularly in the area around Krabang and Bekasi. The landlords were the most important social force, rather, they were the most important class interest. These included Dutch companies, English companies, and Chinese landlords. But from the point of view of the Lashkar Rakyat, they were all a part of the colonial social order. So their enemies were the landowners rather than intellectuals or the military.
Maybe, if it is the enemy itself is not. So the main problem in this kind of situation is about the social things that the Dutch constructed at the beginning, the landlords, the bureaucrats, and also the society that made everything really bad, every single destruction that it is held by the Dutch itself. So maybe is there any question? Maybe Mr. Fuad, I see Mr. Fuad. Mr. Fuad, did you raise your hand? So you have a question maybe. No, you don't have any question. Okay.
So I could say a little bit more about the situation in Kerawang and Bekasi, because it was a special situation in Indonesian history. As you probably know, the Dutch had a policy that Indonesians could not sell land to Europeans or Chinese. This was a policy that was meant to keep village society intact and to make the village available as a unit for Dutch exploitation. But in the long term, it had a very positive effect that Europeans and Chinese in most parts of Indonesia could not own land. The area east of Jakarta, and to some extent the area west of Jakarta, Tangerang, was an exception. In those areas, dating from the time of the English at the beginning of the 19th century, there were private estates called Tanah Partikulier or Partikuliere Landerijen, which were privately owned by, as I said, by English companies, Dutch companies, and by Chinese and even some Arab landlords. So in this region, the peasants, the farm workers were truly poor. They didn't have any access to their own land in the way that peasants in Central Java or in East Java or in other parts of Java had access to their own land, even if they didn't have free access there. But in the Jakarta area, they were very much dominated by the landlords, and that is probably important as a basis for the revolution there. The peasants in the Jakarta area had nothing to lose. They were revolutionary.
So, sir, there is one question that I have to ask to you from Mr. Akbar. he said that how can we distinguish social banditry from robber or one dubbed as Jamino and Joliteng by Wee Siam Jing and underlined by James Siegel, talking about with paramilitary forces after the fact is somehow elusive, since memories are plastic, shaped by retelling and the context of people's life. How can we prevent our research from being just a prosthetic? Is there a method that can be used or something that needs to be carefully considered? Or he is asked about your methods, about your research, how to retain your research that it is really either idealistic or maybe somehow it is corrupted by the retailers or maybe something. Maybe you can answer that.
Yes, that is a very good question. Those are two very good questions. To answer the first one, I think that the further back we go in history, the more the Garong in the Jakarta area are simply robbers. There is no political opportunity available for them, and so they are interested in their careers as criminals. They are local toughs. They are local bandits. The distinctive thing about 1945 is that it came immediately after the Japanese occupation, which was a time of intense political mobilization for all Indonesians. This was the first time when a government in Indonesia had actually attempted to talk to the mass of the people. Many of you will have seen pictures of Japanese wartime propaganda. It looks very crude. It looks very, very simple. But it was important because this was the first time when there was propaganda directed at ordinary people. And this propaganda was also read, of course, by the Garong, by the criminals in Jakarta. So there was a moment of mobilization in 1945, which I think should not be read back too far into into earlier history. When we look at people like Jamino and Joliteng, we can sometimes find elements of social banditry of the kind that Hobsbawm identified. But some of these elements are a consequence of the way of life of bandits. Bandits cannot carry very much with them. If they rob a house, they can't take the furniture away. They can't take the big things with them, but they can give the big things to other people. So they buy support by giving things to other members of the community. That doesn't make them progressive, but it does make them social bandits. So it's a very good question, and I think the answer is that 1945 was a special moment of social mobilization because of the opportunity that arose from the Declaration of Independence and because of the immediate background of Japanese propaganda. And then you have the very good question about the plasticity of memory, the way in which memory changes, and the way in which people acquire memories from public culture. They acquire memories from films, they acquire memories from songs and so forth. So it's always a real challenge when you're doing history to work out just what, particularly when you're doing oral history, to work out whether people are telling you things that are truly part of their experience or part of experience that they have assimilated from outside, which could be from their immediate community or could be from public culture, things like films. In my research, I had the advantage that I was able to use Dutch military and intelligence reports. So I was able to go into the Dutch archives and see archives from the CNIL, from the PID, from the military intelligence sources, which, of course, they're military intelligence. Some things are very reliable, some things are not. You'd never trust everything that you find in a colonial archive. But nonetheless, this was material from the time. And then I was able to use that documentation as a basis for going to Indonesia and talking to people whose interrogation reports I had read in the Dutch archives. And I remember once or twice having a conversation with a former member of the Laskar Rakyat and thinking, I know you already because I read your interrogation, and the personality that I could see in the interrogation, I now see sitting in front of me. So that only happened once or twice. It was a rare occasion, but it felt very good. So of course I can't be sure that I got everything right. And there is one very good example of something that I missed. We all know now about the massacre at Rawagede, the pembantaian massal of Indonesian resistance forces at Rawagede in late 1947. And I didn't know about it. No one talked to me about it, and I didn't find it in the Dutch archives. So something that is so important didn't appear either in the records that I looked at or in the interviews. So I have to be humble and admit that I miss things. I didn't get everything right. But I did have the advantage at the time of using written sources from the revolution itself, and also talking to people while their memories were still relatively fresh.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for the explanation. Maybe the next question will come from Mr. Muhammad Tijar. You raised your hand several times ago. You have some question?
Yes, I have question, but it's already answered because my question is same with Mr. Akbar about methodology, about the oral sources. Thank you.
Okay. The next one comes from Mr. Daniel Supriyadi.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Cribb. So I've been reading your book, and it's very interesting when you conduct research about the existence of militia, which consists of garong, bandit, etc. So my question is, what makes you interested to conduct such research about them? That's my question. Thank you.
That is a very good question, but it is also a very difficult question. I have always been interested in good stories, in interesting stories. So I suppose I feel that a good historian is a little bit like an investigative journalist in the past. You need to see where the power lies. You need to see who is doing strange things. You need to try and find where the money is going and where it's coming from. So I have always been interested in just following an interesting story. Sometimes the interesting story turns into nothing, but this time it turned out that there was a really important story to be told.
Okay.
Okay, specific things that you want to research about this existence of militia, because when I read your book, there is mentioned their role in the Bersiap period, you know.
Yes.
So what makes you interested to conduct research about this the existence of militia, which consists of garong, rampok, or bandit, etc. I mean,
well, it came about because I was looking at Jakarta, and Jakarta was an occupied city, but it was surrounded by a military border. The Dutch troops patrolled the border, and on the other side were the Lashkar. The Lashkar made it very difficult to import rice into the city. So that was one of the issues that first made me aware of what was going on the other side of the border, because many people in Jakarta found it very difficult to find food. Even though there was plenty of food in the countryside, the food couldn't come into Jakarta because there was a blockade by the Lashkar. They didn't want to feed the Dutch forces in the city. So from that, I understood, okay, these Lashkar were actually very important. And so I began to examine, well, to try to work out just who they were and what they were doing, why they thought that it was important to have a blockade.
Is it enough, Mr. Daniel Supriyadi?
Okay, yes, Mr. Agung. Okay, thank you for your explanation, Mr. Cribb.
So it's about what is it? Blockade.
Blockade, yes.
From Laskar.
Yes, okay. Blockade by Laskar.
Yeah, it's blocked by the Laskar.
That's right. So, yes.
Okay, Mr. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh, and Daniel in the chat mentions the book Batavia Kala Malam. So that is a very good book, which it challenges some of my conclusions, because I was more inclined to see the political consciousness of the Garong as reaching further back into the colonial period. So that book has changed my thinking about the origins of the Lashkar. So whereas at one stage I thought that we could trace the political consciousness of the Garong back well into the colonial period. Margreet van Til, the author of Batavia Kala Malam, has really shown that I was probably too optimistic. And so I'm now inclined to say that this was a product of the special circumstances of 1945 coming after the Japanese occupation.
Okay, that is one of the reasons that I asked you the first question. What is the aim of the Laskar? So because I have read the Kala Malam book actually, so that's why I asked you about the first goal, or maybe the natural goal of the Laskar itself, but it's already answered. So the next question comes from Miss Prita, Miss or Mr. I don't know, maybe Miss Prita. Hello, it's delivered in Indonesia actually, Mr. Cribb. Halo Pak Cribb, salam dari Pak JJ Rizal. Saya suka sekali dan buku para jago, bilang seperti itu, Profesor Cribb. Saya kadang membandingkan dengan negara Infantil, Batavia kala malam sudah dibahas. Keduanya membicarakan para jago Jakarta. Ada suatu yang menarik dengan apa peranan jago sebagai tenaga militer di kala revolusi, mengapa mereka tidak diangkat menjadi BKR, Badan Keamanan Rakyat, yang tidak salah namanya seperti itu, dan apa yang mendasari Hatta pada tahun 1947 mengeluarkan kebijakan restrukturasi militer dan menghilangkan peranan jago dan laskar rakyat. You got the question?
Oh, I see. This is from Prita.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It is
okay. Yes. So the question is why they didn't join the BKR.
Yeah.
And why Hatta was interested in restructuring the military. So the reason for not joining the BKR is, I think, that in 1945 the BKR did not seem to be the only real army. It was one amongst many organizations. We can perhaps understand what was happening if we look at the normal politics of NGOs in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, it's very rare to have a single large NGO that encompasses a single issue. There's normally many rival organizations. So the NGO world tends to be split into many different organizations, each with its own leaders, each with its own special idea of what the nature of the issues are. If we think of how NGOs in Indonesia today tend to be divided, we go back to 1945, and it's not surprising that the Badan Perjuangan were themselves very much divided. Each Badan Perjuangan had its own idea of what the strategic and tactical situation was. Even if everyone believed in independence for Indonesia, what they thought needed to be done at any one moment varied greatly. And particularly because the Badan Keamanan Rakyat associated with the government was inclined to be cautious. They didn't want to provoke a fight with the British to begin with, and then later with the Dutch, because they were afraid they would be defeated. The Lashkar, on the other hand, weren't restricted by that kind of fear of being defeated. They were simply determined to fight in the moment, to fight at that time. So later on, when Hatta became Prime Minister, he had two concerns. First was that he wanted to be able to, actually three concerns, I should say. First, he thought, along with General Nasution, that the most effective way of fighting the Dutch was with a Dutch-style army. So he supported Nasution's idea of creating a modern, disciplined military that was separate from the rest of society, in the way that armies normally are separate from the rest of society. So that was first. The second was that he wanted to be able to control military action as part of the dealings with the Dutch. He wanted to be able to say, okay, we will call a ceasefire and to have the army, to have the armed forces obey. The Lashkar were not necessarily going to obey anyone. And so that was, from Hatta's point of view, they were an inconvenience, possibly even a danger. And then the third thing was that over time, some of the Lashkar became closely associated either with the PKI or with Tan Malaka. And therefore they were the ideological enemies of Hatta. And therefore he wanted to exclude them. Oh, sorry, you're
still mute.
Okay, sorry. My bad. Thank you for answering the question. It is actually a really tough question to delivering something about Laskar and also the PKI and also the Hatta pictures of military interactions between the nation. So, Mr. Fijar, you raise your hand and you have the question. So it's your turn then.
Yeah. Okay. My question is, first of all, it's a great book. It's great research, and the way I like your research is how you keep it balanced between the written document source and the oral sources. I mean, it's a how I want to question about how you keep a distance between the bias in the writing document and the bias in the oral sources. I mean, it's in the writing document is about the big thing. The Dutch maybe most of talk bad about us, right? Talk about bad, and the oral sources is always say the bad side of the Dutch. I mean, how you can keep the distance between these two sources and keep it balanced to retell the story as a historian way. I mean, yes, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a very good question too. I suppose that I don't have a good answer because it's always a matter of trying but not being confident that you always succeed. However, what I do try to do is to see the point of view of each side. So I also did many interviews in Holland. I talked to Dutch bureaucrats, Dutch politicians, Dutch soldiers who had been in Jakarta during the revolution, and some of them were very nice people. Some of them looked back on what they had done and regretted that they didn't understand then what was at stake. Some of them were not so nice. Some of them didn't have any regrets. Also on the Indonesian side, not everyone that I talked to, there were some people I didn't actually like very much. But basically, I tried to take everyone seriously. I tried to work out, okay, what was this person trying to achieve? And so rather than blaming them for their mistakes or blaming them for their prejudice, I tried to think, okay, what was it that they thought about the situation and what were they trying to achieve? It's not a good answer, but I do consciously try to be fair to both sides.
So you tried your best to balance the methodology and the samples also in your research. Maybe Mr. Fijar, you have any question for this question?
Actually, it's because when in my undergraduate thesis, and then my lecturer say that your research is too recent through Jakarta. I research my research in Sumatra, but my source is to Jakarta. I mean, it's to hide, gitu, to see the problem in the Sumatra, gitu, the Sumatrans. So I must more approach in the oral sources. And then my friends is recommended me your book, sir. I mean, you can try to read this book because it's so in the people's perspective, not from the Dutch perspective. It's a good book, sir. And thank you for the answer. And yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So your research is to Jakarta. It means that you are two governmental centuries in terms of
yes, to government centuries. Yes, that's right.
Okay then. The next question comes from my friend Rihan Aziri, Mr. Cribb. He said that apakah bandit itu dan garong ini yang menjadikan alasan kelompok Tionghoa membentuk Pau Antui? You get the question, sir?
Yes.
Apakah bandit atau garong bumi putra ini yang menjadikan alasan kelompok Tionghoa membentuk Pau Antui? Dan bagaimana gesekan yang terjadi antara para militer Tionghoa ini dengan para bandit atau garong tersebut? Jika cerita sejarah antara Pau Antui dipisahkan, mungkin akan melihat keduanya adalah para pahlawan bagi kelompok masing. Tapi bagaimana jika the two of the story it is combined together? Apakah ketika story-nya digabungkan, apakah masih terlihat seperti pahlawan keduanya? Apakah ada the other side? The other side is a criminal, the other side is heroes. Maybe something like that equation.
Yeah. Now that is a very good question and also a very difficult question. And the difficulty is that Chinese Indonesians were very much divided by the circumstances of the revolution. Many of them hoped that, well, most of them simply hoped that peace would come back, but they weren't sure whether the Dutch would restore peace or the Indonesian Republic would restore peace. Some of them hoped that somehow the Chinese government would help, and the fact that there were some groups within the Chinese community who appeared not to be enthusiastic about Indonesian independence meant that they were seen as agents of the Dutch and therefore as dangerous, and they were targeted for plunder and for killing. Many of you will know about the massacre of Chinese in Tangerang in 1946. There were also smaller killings of Chinese in the Kerawang area. So Pau Antui was in many respects a response to the fear of the Chinese community that they were in danger from the Badan Perjuangan, from the Lashkar. The problem was then that by being part of a military organization that had the approval of the Dutch, they appeared to be on the side of the Dutch, and that in many ways made their position even worse. So it would be a real challenge to write the story of those two sets of organizations. They had different origins and they worked in different ways, but it's a really good question to juxtapose them, to put them together like that.
There is some perspective about the ideal and the identity of groups. So they maybe have some other perspective for the other group also. So maybe something like that, right? Okay, the next question maybe comes from Guido Giorgiano. Since the Laskar Rakyat things is news to me, as a school never taught me this, I have some things to ask you, Professor Cribb. If I'm not misheard, you made a claim that this Laskar is somewhat group of criminals, and along the way they work together with military. The first question is, how far did the deal between the two go? Meaning, is there any transactional interest between them, or is it just purely for the sake of common interest to go against the colonialism? Because as we know, it's pretty bizarre knowing the authority working together with criminals, and this cannot be true because, yeah, you know that the authority cannot come together with the criminals. And the second question is, how far or how big did the contribution that the Laskar Rakyat make at that time to go against the Dutch and colonialism? Hopefully you don't mind to answer the question. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Guido, for those questions. That's also very interesting. So the relations between the military and the Lashkar varied a great deal. So the first commander of the army, when the army units withdrew from Jakarta and went to Bekasi, the first commander was a man named Mufreni Mukmin, and he was rather sympathetic to the Lashkar. He got on fairly well with them, and he, at least they managed to work together. His successors as local army commanders were much more conventional military officers, and they disapproved of the Lashkar. They wanted the Lashkar only to obey orders, to be subordinate to the military, and therefore the collaboration between them was not very good at all. And it even led to a rather bizarre incident in which one group of Lashkars deserted and joined the Dutch. So they formed what the Dutch called Hare Majesteits Ongeregelde Troepen, or HAMOT, so Her Majesty's Irregular Troops. So it was a Lashkar group which was coordinated by a Dutch lieutenant, Lieutenant Bavinck, and they took part in the military action against the Republic in July 1947. So they were, and the reason for doing that was that their relations with the Indonesian military had become so bad, they thought they would get a better deal from the Dutch. In fact, after a few months, they then decided that the Dutch were no better, and they deserted back to the Republic. So it was that was a complicated story. So your question then was, how much contribution did the Lashkar make to the struggle against colonialism? So in my view, the Lashkar was instrumental in preventing the Dutch from moving outside Jakarta and from taking over West Java. If the Lashkar had not been there, then the Indonesian army, the formal army, the official army, would not have been strong enough to prevent the Dutch from seizing control of much of the island, and perhaps destroying the Indonesian Republic as it was declared in 1945. So I think their role was very important. After the middle of 1947, their role was no longer very important. They were part of the resistance movement to the Dutch in West Java, but they were not especially important, not especially effective. So the last part of the book is about a group whose importance is steadily diminishing, steadily becoming less important.
Okay, Professor Cribb, thank you for answering the question. It seems like every single question is difficult but interesting, right? And
Yes.
that's why all of the members of this discussion is really excited to uh, ask something to you, because you said it is interesting and also difficult. But in the same time, you can, what is it? You can answer it correctly and really complex in delivering the answer, sir. So that must be great for this discussion. That's why Mr. Ganel Supriyadi asking more and more questions to you. Maybe Mr. Supriyadi can what is it can deliver the question for Mr.
Okay.
Cribb.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Agung. Mr. Kip, when you talk about the Hamot created by Captain Kurt Baving, my question is why did some of the militia or Laskar member were deserted and joined the Hamot? That's the first. Two, in the book you mentioned about the Bersiap period. You see, it is a violence situation, violence against Netherlands and European. So my question is, which element of militia or Laskar involved in the Bersiap period? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I was never able to talk to any member of the Hamot except for the Lieutenant Bavink, the Dutch man, the Dutch officer who commanded the unit. So I didn't find from them their own story. I talked to other Lashkar who were, on the one hand, of course, very disappointed that they deserted to the Dutch, but on the other hand, often told me that it was because of the very bad relations between the Lashkar and the Indonesian army. So the Hamot faced perhaps being disbanded or destroyed by their own side, and they decided that the only way of saving themselves was to join the Dutch side. So it's a sign, on the one hand, that their loyalty to the Republic was limited. On the other hand, it's not really surprising that when they faced destruction, they would seek a way out of it. And the question of which groups were involved in the Bersiap killings is very interesting, very important, and I don't have a good answer to it. And that is because those very early days, the shape of the organizations was not clear. Of course, sometimes people did give their groups a name, but they were very fluid. They weren't well demarcated. And the majority of descriptions that I saw of that were written by Indonesian participants in the Bersiap referred to skirmishes between Indonesian and Dutch militia groups. So they didn't refer to the killing of civilians. They didn't refer to the killing of women and children. So that was one of those areas where none of my sources was able to help.
Okay, so it's still unclear which of element involved in the Bersiap period, isn't it?
It's still unclear, yes.
Yes. So I also read in your book that finally, at the end, Captain Kurt Baving disbanded the Hamot. Why did he do that? Why did he disband the Hamot unit?
It was for two reasons. The first was that they were no longer useful to the Dutch. And the second is that they were becoming difficult to control. They were not disciplined, and so he was having a lot of difficulty trying to keep them under control, and he thought it was better just to disperse them. But then they went back and they became a Lashkar unit again.
Okay. Thank you for your explanation, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Supriyadi, for the questions. It's very interesting question, but also difficult, I think. But Mr. Professor Cribb actually can answer it well. And myself, Professor Cribb, I have a question for Indonesians actually. Then today I meet you, and this will be a very memorable thing for me. I have a question maybe for you. What is the most difficult things for Indonesians to study Indonesia? I mean, like every single Indonesian people cannot study in a good condition, or maybe in a good situation, because we have the bias itself. But we really love our country. How about you, as an Indonesianist, how difficult to study Indonesian culture, Indonesian situation, the stories, or maybe something in political or something like that, because we do not know either how to justify it is wrong or it is correct, because almost all Indonesians have their own perspectives. And lately I meet you, so I asked this question to you, special to you. Thank you, sir.
Oh, that might be the most difficult question of all.
No.
So, what has always excited me about Indonesia is the sense of Indonesians aspiring, aiming to do good things for their country. And of course, there are many different ways in which people have aspired to do good for their country, and some of them are completely contradictory. You can't have everything all at once. You can't have. There are many different political forms. You can't achieve all of them. But what I find exciting about Indonesia is the sense of possibility, the sense that here is a country in which so much could be improved, so much could be made great. The difficult thing, the things that make me feel disappointed are when I read about people being selfish, people only being interested in their own interests. It's the same when I look at Australian politics. When I look at our leaders, sometimes I feel malu, I feel ashamed, because they have a narrow vision and they don't see the possibilities. So I'm always interested in what the possibilities are, and also in what the possibilities were in the past. So I like to go back. The exciting thing about history is to go back and to see people, the majority of people, trying to do good things, to achieve good things for their community, for their country. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're completely wrong, and what they do is a disaster. But we learn from disasters that we might need to do something different.
That's a good answer, maybe. But yeah, maybe we can learn from disaster, and maybe we can only be erased by the disaster itself. I mean, like every single Laskar today doesn't exist in every book in Indonesian people's book, in our educational system and everything. That's really miserable for Indonesian people. They cannot learn something that you has written. I mean, like you know the stories, you knew the story. But Indonesia itself doesn't know the story until today, until you deliver it to us. I mean, like, thank you so much for your present, for your ideas, for your books, for everything. Maybe the member of this discussion have some question for Mr. Cribb. It is a rare occasion as permission is come to our discussion, then it is really good. What is it? Chance to us to ask about everything. Maybe I will go back to Mr. Fuad. Mr. Fuad, you already know how to deliver your question. Maybe is there Mr. Fuad here? That is Mr. Fuad. Oh, he left the discussion. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Maybe another member of this discussion would like to deliver a question about Laskar or about Indonesian independence, because today we are celebrating our Independence Day. Although we never know what is the meaning of independence itself, because we are still not independent until today regarding the of what is it, including the economic, including all these pandemic, and also the bureaucracy, the politics, the vaccine. We are not really dependent on those things. Maybe you guys having the question for Professor Robert Cribb, because this is a really interesting occasion. If you guys
Hello,
realize.
can I ask?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe you can ask something difficult and also interesting.
Okay. Okay. Okay, when you talk about RERA program reconstruction and rationalization, it also run by for my not acknowledge it also run by Minister Amir Syarifuddin, not only Hatta. But my question about Colonel Mufreni Mu'min, was he a former Heiho or PETA? Sorry, I forgot about him.
Oh, yes, that's a good question. I think he was former Heiho, but not former PETA. I'm not I can't remember now. That's
Okay.
And yes, it's certainly true that Amir Syarifuddin, who was Minister of Defense, was very much involved in a reorganization, but his RERA was different from the RERA of Hatta. So Amir Syarifuddin was keen to bring Persindo and to bring left-wing Lashkar into the armed forces, and also to have something like political commissars attached to army units. So his model was something a little bit more like the Red Army, the army of the Soviet Union. Whereas Hatta's model was much more a Western style army that would be professional, technically oriented, highly disciplined, and able to fight the Dutch army on its own terms, rather than as a mass or ideologically driven army.
And also in your book, you mentioned about the relation between criminal world, or you mentioned it, dunia hitam, with the national movement and the some of national movement during a revolution. I think it's a very interesting when you mention about those relations between the dunia hitam, or maybe we call it underground or criminal gang with the national movement. So how did you find it interested to make a research?
Oh, well, I suppose it's a little bit like I said before. It was a really interesting story, and I thought, this is something that no one has looked at in the past, and I didn't embark on it to uncover the underside or the dark side of Indonesian nationalism. What it seemed to me was that this showed how widespread the idea of Indonesian independence was amongst the Indonesian people. When I was an undergraduate, there was some discussion amongst historians to say that, well, Indonesia was only the creation of a small elite, that the mass of the people were really not involved. And even as a student, I wasn't convinced by that. I thought that probably the idea of Indonesia had wider appeal than these historians were suggesting. And so when I found the Lashkar, I was excited.
Okay,
thank you for your
so
explanation.
Okay. Maybe Mr. Daniel Suparjadi, you can write something about Indonesian too, maybe, or about Australia. You guys will become a good rival each other. You can challenge your knowledge each other. Future maybe. That's a really good idea, I think, for you guys too. And especially, maybe the last question will come from the Mother Club itself, from my friend Reza Maulana Hikam. If you, what is it? Where is Reza? You already raised your hand. Yeah. This is my man. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Agung, and thank you very much, Professor Robert Cribb, for allowing us to have discussion with you. So, I've been reading your book quite fast lately because I want to know much inside. So, there is one pages that makes me quite, interested, is that you have a interview with Maruto Nitimiharjo. If I'm not mistaken, this was PSI or Murba. Yeah. And several other people. I want to ask you one thing. So lately, we can see that, like the Taliban who came from, warlords. So if I see that this Jago and Bandit was kind of a warlord, what happened with them after the Indonesian Revolution? Did any of them succeeded in becoming legal, like Godfather, or they became, persecuted by the government? Thank you, sir.
Well, yes, that's a very interesting question too. The most significant one after the revolution was Imam Shafi'i, who later became a minister in one of the very last cabinets of Sukarno, the Cabinet 100 Menteri. So I forget which post he had. So he was a leader. He was a member of the army, but his main job was as a boss in the Jakarta underworld. So he was very important in mobilizing people into the street on behalf of Sukarno. So he was a very successful product of the revolution. Most of the others were not so successful. Some of them managed to move into civilian careers. For instance, some of the leaders became journalists. Some of them joined the Murba party. But Murba never became really successful in Indonesian politics. So for most of them, the revolution was the most important time of their lives. And that was one of the advantages for me when I came to interview them. Because they were no longer important, no one else had ever wanted to interview them. And I came along and I was interested. And because I'd been in the Dutch archives, I knew something about what they had done. So I could ask them some serious questions. So that was another way in which I felt that my research was really, it had a special privilege because I could be the first historian to talk to many of these people. And there were one or two. Mufrani Mukmin was one of them. He ended up becoming a member of parliament. He was a member of Golkar. And I remember trying to interview him, and it was no use at all, because for him, what was important was what he had done in the New Order. And he wasn't interested in talking about the period of the revolution.
Yes, yes. Bureaucrats.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your enlightening explanation, Professor Cribb.
Okay. Thank you so much, Reza, for the question. I think it's a good question, so difficult question for us to answer. Maybe that is the last question that we have, Mr. Professor Robert Cribb. And I'm humbled because you can attend our meeting, our discussion, and you are fluent in using Bahasa Indonesia also. I think that's a good thing that we learned today, because we are loving this country so much, and we have to know something deeper in Indonesia itself regarding the revolutionary action of Indonesian people, the struggle, and also our identity itself. And we are really, really impressed by your knowledge about Laskar and our struggle days back then in 1945. And yeah, I cannot say anything anymore because I'm impressed by your knowledge. Yeah, that's good. The professor of Australia National University, my dream campus, maybe later next month, no, next year, maybe I'll come to Australia and study there to complete my master's degree. I hope to see you in the next occasion. Thank you for your Thank you for your presence today. I cannot say anything anymore because I was impressed by all of the members of this discussion. The discussion really, really live, and I couldn't imagine how far I will go, how far Indonesian will go because this discussion. I hope our discussion today can can present something in the future for our good and for our nation also. So it's a professor, sorry, sir. So Professor Robert Cribb, maybe you have something for your last, or maybe your closing statement for Madat Club, for Komunitas Madani, and also all of the members here, and for Indonesia.
Well,
last statement for us.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a really interesting discussion for me. I don't have many opportunities to talk about Indonesian history with people who really know a great deal. So this has been a special occasion for me as well. And thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you all for your questions. And I think that our discussion also shows just how important history is. If we understand what is possible, what was possible in the past, then we can see that the future is open. There's many possibilities open to us, even in the current very difficult circumstances with COVID-19 and with difficulties in other parts of the world. We can feel that the future is in our hands, and that is exciting. So thank you again. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe this is the last session of our discussion. I thank you, Mr. Professor Robert Cribb, Madat Club, Komunitas Madani Indonesia, my friend Reza Hikam, and also the founders of those two communities and the Indonesia also. So I'll give it back to Mother Club to close the discussion, I think. So the time is yours, Mr. Reza. Thank you, sir.